In a world grappling with interconnected global crises, Martin Oetting is a transformative storyteller who has journeyed from the sales-obsessed world of consumer advertising to the front lines of economic reimagination. His new documentary, Purpose, is more than just Martin's first feature-length film. It's a profound exploration of humanity's most pressing question. How can we redesign economic systems to serve people and planet? Born into a family with deep social democratic roots, his father a federal delegate in the German parliament after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Martin's commitment to social justice was cultivated early. What began as teenage songwriting about liberty and systemic change has evolved into a mission to expose the fundamental flaws in our current economic paradigm. After years in marketing, Martin discovered a critical truth. Our economies are not immutable forces of nature, but human constructs we can fundamentally reshape, that we can make and remake whenever we like. His recent work focuses on the champions of economic transformation, individuals like Catherine Trebeck and Italian Minister for Economic Development Lorenzo Fioramonte, who are pioneering alternative models that prioritize the well-being of people and planet over endless economic growth. Purpose is a testament to Martin's belief that storytelling can be a powerful catalyst for systemic change. By documenting the emergence of the wellbeing economy governments, an alliance of Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland, Wales, and Finland, he reveals a hopeful narrative of economic innovation that challenges the status quo. Martin is a strategic optimist. He sees our current economic crisis not as an insurmountable challenge, but as an unprecedented opportunity to reimagine how we organise our societies, distribute resources, and define progress. And I tend to agree. In an era marked by climate emergency, rising inequality, and democratic strain, Martin offers a compelling vision that economies can be redesigned to nurture human potential and planetary health. His work invites us to see economic systems not as concrete systems, but as collaborative designs we can continuously mould and shape and improve. Martin, welcome to Chasing Financial Equality.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
What is your film Purpose about? What is the purpose economy?
I think that answer has two parts. The first one is what made me want to make it. And I think that's essentially two extraordinary individuals who are doing the kind of work I didn't know existed until I met them. And, you have to bear in mind that the country I grew up in as a kid was West Germany before the wall fell. And that was a country that needed its own economic growth as a validation to exist in the world. West Germany after the war, after the Nazi era, in which basically the political system of this country set out to destroy the world and kill millions of people in endless horrific ways. Sort of the country that came after this, at least in the western part, not under communist regime, needed something to validate its existence and show the world that we still have the right to be there and to sort of contribute. And economic growth was it. Economic growth in GDP terms was what we used to validate our sort of, our being in the world. And when I met Catherine and she pointed out to me in much detail and in a very compelling way that the GDP and growing it is a recipe for disaster nowadays and is going to lead us into the abyss, and that she had a project to do something about it, and a project that tried to take on the G7, the group of the mightiest economic powers in the world, no less. That was to me such a David against Goliath story that I kind of had thought, if no one is telling that story, then something is going wrong. Like, these people's story needs to be told. And then I found out about Lorenzo through that. So that's why I wanted to tell their story. Coming from this West German background and hearing about someone who wanted to change this logic in our economies. What it became about is a very simple question, really. And the question is, do we want to use money made in a year as a yardstick for how well our society is doing? Or do we want to measure how well our society is doing and use that as the yardstick? That really is what Purpose is asking, because the factor that defines whether a country considers itself successful economically or not is the GDP. And the GDP is nothing but the amount of money made in that country in a year. And once that is more than last year, that country likes to think of itself as economically successful. But the problem is that that measure has so many flaws and creates so many problems and is so completely ignorant of the key things that will determine our success in the future that it's high time to move away from it. But it's been so entrenched and established in all of our systems around the world that it seems an almost impossible task. And these two people took on that task and are saying, if we don't redirect our economies towards goals and objectives that really do make sense for us and for the world that we live in, we're making a horrendous mistake, and we need to rectify that. And so that's the second part of the answer.
In the film, you cover Lorenzo giving a speech when his party announced their team ahead of the general elections in Italy. And Lorenzo said there's a growth in dissatisfaction all around the world. People are increasingly dissatisfied with their lives. And I think people are feeling that, even if they might not be able to put words to it as well as Lorenzo does. Lorenzo and Catherine are both political economists. Catherine is actually an Australian who lives in Scotland now. But Catherine says in the film that whenever you sit down and ask people what matters to them, they'll almost always talk about their family, their job security and satisfaction, feeling safe at home and having good health. Why doesn't the economy that we've built reflect what matters to people?
I understand it, and I have to sort of say this with a bit of caution because I'm not an economist. So whatever I say comes out of what I've learned, mainly speaking to these and other remarkable people. But I think the main reason is that we adopted a measurement that was basically I'm trying to find the right word. It was basically just a short-term solution for a short-term problem. The GDP was designed for other purposes, and even the creator of the GDP, Simon Kuznets, he cautioned American politicians against using it as a measure of societal progress. But it was convenient, it was easy to obtain, and it seemed to make some sense, particularly after World War II, to basically figure out, is the country making more money? That means, more for everyone. That's going to work out fine. I think the problem arose when we decided to embed and integrate this into every part of our political systems and governance structures around the world, both national, local, regional, but also, supranational, international. So we basically used the wrong yardstick to figure out whether we're going in the right direction, or at least a yardstick that is flawed for the challenges of at least of the 21st century, probably also flawed for the second, the last quarter of the last century, which is all about just counting money. And if you count money and think that's going to help, and money on the aggregate level, it's not looking at individual income statements and individual sort of distribution of wealth and equality. It's looking at the aggregate, the country as a whole. You know nothing about whether the richest get richer and the poorest get poorer, but the net effect is somehow the country overall made more money. It's just money made, and that just doesn't help us anymore.
Was there a pivotal moment that you can remember where you first started to realize that our current economic system or our model is fundamentally broken?
Yes, there was. That was 2016 American presidential election where Donald Trump became president for the first time. I had fairly strong connections to America throughout my life. I had spent a year as an exchange student there when I was 17, 18. I had friends or have friends in America. I've traveled there a number of times. I once had a 2-year relationship with a woman from America, which was a long distance relationship for a while, and then we lived together. So I think I had sort of more connections with the US than average Germans do. I'm not saying I was super steeped in American life and traditions, but I had some connections to the country. And this country that I knew a little bit about elected what I would call now a proto-fascist at the time to become president, someone with incredibly extreme stances on a whole number of things. And, those stances were not just something he said during the campaign, it was something that materialized in the way he acted afterwards. I realized that something has gone horribly awry in the way our democracies work, or at least the American democracy is sort of a lighthouse for much democratic development around the world. And I wanted to understand what it was, what was going on. And then I started to read and to speak with people and that's why I ended up meeting Catherine Trebeck and Lorenzo Fioramonti, because of this quest of saying what went wrong in America and how can a country that has been such an economic powerhouse almost seem to go to this desperate solution of voting for a man who seemed completely, unelectionable, if that's a word, to me. I think that's what it was. It was the Trump election in 2016.
I think it's really interesting that you say, how can this country that is perceivably this economic powerhouse that the world is told is, the leader of the economic world, how is it that they are reacting so desperately with a financial solution to a problem that we might not be able to see? Is that reflective of the fact that probably we're not measuring the right things when it comes to what makes an economic or a successful powerhouse country?
Precisely. And a few days ago, I published a piece on YouTube in German, so it will be difficult for this audience. But and I published it because at the end of November of last year, public broadcasting, the big public broadcasting company in Germany, had a 10-minute segment about economic growth. Why do we need it? Question mark. And I was excited about this, and I watched it, and it utterly crushing. It was a complete propaganda piece. The sort of the chorus that kept coming back in the piece was, "Look at America. Look at the growth in America. They're doing it right, and we're not doing it well. We're like Japan. We're stagnating. We're not moving forward. Look at America." And in my response piece, I said, why do we want to look at America when that country is clearly doing badly? It's clearly going wrong, is destroying its democracy, has a lower life expectancy than many other, developed nations, and has incredibly crumbling infrastructure, has all of these things going wrong. Why on earth do we keep pointing our finger to America and saying those are the guys who know how it's done, when the only thing that seems to look good is the GDP curve, but nothing else? And that's where I think we've baked this obsession with GDP growth so much into all of our systems and into our psyches as well, into our narratives about the world and the future, that it's becoming really dangerous now. On a, almost like a disease that we need to get rid of.
Before we hit record, you and I were speaking, and you noted the challenge that we have in communicating what Maslow is all about is quite dense. There's a lot of education involved. It's my turn now, and in the film, you grapple with concepts that are so far beyond the ordinary thoughts of people. And I don't want to say capacity or capability, and I think a lot of people do that, and it's condescending. But the concepts that you're dealing with here are a long way away from the daily thoughts and goings on of ordinary people. The film opens with you drawing, or one of the opening scenes of the film is you drawing complex concepts on a whiteboard and joining them together. Is it hard to present thoughts to people that are so far away from the challenges and distractions of their day?
The simple answer is yes. It is hard. But I would like to point out one thing that is maybe helpful to keep in mind when we talk about this. The growth economy, the economy that keeps us pushing for more every day, is also the economy that takes time away from us for anything else. So if we had, let's just imagine, we all had 3 or 4 day work weeks. There would be time to know more things than we do about the economy, economic mechanisms. And I tend to I like this saying that we need to turn economics into a popular sport. Like economics needs to become people's pastime. If that was, even though that might sound a bit preposterous, but still, I think that's an important one. So you're absolutely spot on when you say it's condescending to say people can't understand these things or they're too difficult to comprehend. They're not. I think we've gotten used to a class of economists who like to make it look that way. And that's because that makes them powerful, that makes them seem important, that makes them seem like the oracles that can give us the wisdom that no one else can, when in fact, the economy is about one thing and one thing only. Who gets to use what types of resources, how, when, where, and why. That's what the economy is about. And figuring this out has a lot of philosophical underpinnings, has a lot of, questions about what's fair and right and what's just. And it's not a mathematical exercise, even though we're led to believe that it is, oftentimes by the economists that get to have a say these days. So it is incredibly hard to explain some of these things, not because they're so complicated, but because people simply don't have the mental bandwidth to deal with these things. And I think part of the job is to make sure that we redesign our societies in such a way that people can actually be critical citizens who say, wait a second, that economic growth we had last year, if we look at the way wealth and income have been distributed during that year, it's not benefiting me. It's not benefiting my neighbor. It's not benefiting the guy down the road. Let's stop with the economic growth debate and, like wringing ever more out of our society. Let's talk about what they all get and why they get it and why that's unfair.
They often say to people, and it surprises them, that economics is a social science. That's all it is. And if you say that, people think, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't correlate to my understanding of what economics is. And that's because we're using economics through the wrong lens. Can you tell us, in your own words, what is a well-being economy?
I will. Allow me just to add one thing to what you
Yeah.
said about economics being a social science. One thing I was incredibly specific about was the lower third, the name tag that Joseph Stiglitz gets in our film. He's in our film, and you see him as part of a conference. And I had to put there that he's an economist and that he won the prize in memory of Alfred Nobel. My friends, the people I worked with, they said to me, why do you make it so complicated? Let's just say he won the Nobel Prize. And I say, no, he didn't. Because Nobel never wanted a Nobel Prize. He never funded one. They invented it decades after he had passed away. And a rumor has it that he hated economists. So economists try to make themselves these mathematician / natural scientists who don't come up with concepts and tell us what their philosophy is. No, they give us the laws of nature, and that's just plain wrong. It is exactly as you say. It's an incredibly messy science about how we, these weird animals that populate this earth, behave. It's a behavioral science. It's a social science, and you're completely right about that. So I had to just get that out and agree with you 100%. Now, about a well-being economy, I have done academic work myself in the past. I got a doctorate in business, in marketing years ago. And my understanding of how you describe sort of academic concepts is one that's also very Germanic. It's you need frameworks, and you need sort of all the systems, and you need to understand how it all connects and why there's a logic, an internal one. And I waited to be told about this internal logic for the well-being economy. I waited for someone, Catherine, Lorenzo, someone else, to give me exactly that kind of framework and explain to me, this is how it works. This is the conveyor belt, and here are the little bolts and screws, and this is how it all sits together. And they never did. And at some point I realized, essentially, a well-being economy basically does two things. And then it sort of gets out of the way. And the two things are, step one, let's get together as a society and debate. And then sort of in a well-informed debate amongst sort of everyone who's sort of involved in this process, citizens of all shapes and sizes, all walks of life, economics as a popular sport. Let's debate together what we want our economy and our society to be about. What do we want to achieve with what we do? Let's put this down. Let's turn it into indicators that we can measure so that we can figure out whether there's progress in these areas. And then it's a competition for everyone to compete on finding the best solutions for getting there. So let's say if we agree that for our society, for the world that we live in, it is incredibly helpful and important that every year for the foreseeable, let's say for the next 15 years, we increase the space of wooded area of forest in our country by, say, 10% every year, then we put this in. This is our measurement. This is what we are measured against every year. Now, everyone, companies, individuals, NGOs, whoever, come up with your ideas for how to get there, and politics will be there to support you because this is what we agreed upon. So it is, and the practitioners and the academics who who are developing and designing the well-being economy concepts and write the papers about it and do the webinars, I'm sure they'll disagree with me and they'll say, oh, it's way more complicated than that. And I'm sure it is. But essentially, to me, this idea that we need purpose, hence the name of the film, that we design together, we figure out what's the direction we want to go in as a society. And then we basically invite everyone to do their best to contribute to that direction. That's what it is. And the idea is that we don't design an economy that says the purpose in our direction is to make the rich richer and to count more money at the end of the year, because somehow that will benefit us all, because we know it doesn't. So what is the purpose that we're going? And let's measure the coherence, the connectedness of society. Let's find a measurement that shows us whether neighborhoods are talking to one another, whether people find friends in their neighborhoods, whether they trust each other, the trust in neighborhoods. Let's make that a measurement and say that needs to increase. That's a political job. The forest areas of our country, the CO2 emissions of our country, they need to go down drastically. Like, those are the jobs. Those are the ones we focus on. And those are the jobs we give to the economy and say, that's what you need to figure out. And if at the end of those 15 years, we find out that we've achieved all of those objectives, we made a better, fairer, more sustainable society, and then we look at GDP and we find out, what do you know? It's grown. Then we'll say, well, then we'll call ourselves growth agnostic. Then we'll just say, it is what it is, and we don't even care. It's probably not likely that GDP will have grown that way. But what has grown is the quality of all of our lives and the sustainability of human life on Earth.
I think, speaking about making an economic system that makes the rich richer, I made a joke on Christmas Day just gone that Christmas Day was an important time for tolerance, and that at Christmas lunch today there will be children who believe in Santa and grown men who believe in trickle-down economics. And I think it's high time we had that conversation, that trickle-down economics doesn't work in the context world that's interconnected and governed by just so few people. I work quite a lot with academics. I think objectively at the cutting edge of economic change when it comes to designing business models, certainly in the finance industry. And that has me crossing over with academics. And one of the areas of particular interest for me is, and it can be quite contentious with those academics. You said before, the academics will tell me it's more complicated. And I think that's actually a problem we have today. We live in this post-truth soundbite world where everything has to be conveyed in 15 seconds or less, or it doesn't get conveyed at all. I've advocated for academics learning how to tell their narrative in a more compelling way. And I work with and know professor by the name of Nick McGuigan quite well, and he's the head of access, inclusion and diversity at Monash University Business School. And he's an accountant by qualification, and he talks about art in telling complex stories. He talks about using creatives. He talks about music and film. How do you see the role of storytelling in driving systemic economic transformation?
I mean, your question couldn't be more spot on with regards to what it is I'm trying to do, but it also couldn't be more painful. And I'll tell you why. On the one hand, this is exactly what I have been trying to figure out for the last 7 years, and I feel like I don't have that much to show for.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. And that's why it's painful. But I think that's what I've been trying to do with not only the film, but with other projects as well. So I've had for around 7 years, from 2017 until 2024, a project that was a live show format on stage with 4 people. We were a collective, and we called ourselves Volle Halle, which basically translates sort of to an English full house. We just gave us that name as almost as a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can tell you that we did not always perform in front of full houses, but sometimes we did. And Volle Halle was a project that tried to bring that idea to the stage, how to talk about the change that's needed in a way that's compelling. I've been working on a novel, which still isn't done because other things got in the way. I've made a podcast about this very question. How does economic, academic, and political work best translate into art forms that people can relate to? So I'm fully on board with the challenge. I am still trying to figure it out. The film is one attempt. And I think it's a first attempt and it's not as accessible as I would like it to be. But that's also due to the conceit of the film, or the initial objective for the film, which was to follow the path of these two remarkable individuals. And when you follow two people, you're basically forced to adopt the experiences and the stories that happened to them. And much of what happened to them was on the stage of politics and in rooms where political discussions were being had and so forth. So I think it can be done much better. And I think this year I will try more on YouTube to do exactly what you said, to tell more stories in a way that is accessible and that makes sense to people, because I am at this interface between I have done some academic work, but I worked in advertising where it always has to be accessible to people, otherwise it wouldn't work. And I'm trying to sort of bring these things together with what I've learned through my conversations with economists and other brilliant thinkers to do exactly what you said. And it's hard, it's really hard to tell these stories in a way that is compelling for people and that doesn't put them to sleep and that doesn't, seem overcomplicated, but is exactly the challenge. And I also think that it is a challenge that the academics themselves have to take on as well. I think you can't expect to find translators for everything. I think a big and important thing is that academics understand the value of being accessible. I think an academic that tries to talk in ways that only his or her peers understands is basically not doing their job. The job is to find stuff out about the world and then to tell the world about it. Finding stuff out about the world and then telling a very exclusive circle about it, who all talk to each other and quote each other in their papers, is not a service to society. So why do you get paid for it as though it were a service to society? So I think, I don't want to make sort of a blanket statement about all academics, but the ones that don't try to be accessible, that don't try to tell the world something that the world needs to hear, I think they're making a mistake.
I have recently found that there's something in the potential of advertisers, actually. So I find it quite interesting that you come from that background. Advertisers and marketers know that when you're trying to sell a product, if it's a 10-watt, 20-amp phone charger, you don't advertise that. You advertise it as charge your phone in 10 minutes. It's about outcome. It's about how does this product improve my life? And I think academics would be served very well in taking that. How do we convey a feeling or a message to get people to the point where they're going to look further at what we're talking about? And if you're about to buy a phone charger, a 10-minute phone charger, you might at some point look, okay, well, how many watts is it and how many amps is it? And fair enough, I'll buy it. But I think there needs to be an overlay between, these academics, economists, and the people who convey these messages. And I know certainly some academics have very interesting ways of trying to combat that challenge of communication. And as I said, Nick uses art as one way to solve that. I want to go back to your father, actually. Your father opens the film, and he served as a federal delegate in the German parliament. What lessons, if any, did you learn from watching him navigate political systems when you were younger?
I mean, I was very young when he was in politics. He basically left he left the political stage on the federal level in West Germany at the time. Like one digit year numbers, like 5, 6, 7 something years old. So I don't know firsthand how it was for him to be in that space. He did say that he left federal politics because it was no longer his thing. He had done well in municipal politics in my hometown. He had done well on the regional level as well, but then once it got to the federal level, he felt no longer that that's where he could, have his strongest impact or work well, simply put. And I think one of the reasons is that we share a trait, which is that we're both very direct. My father and I tend to sort of take an issue, a difference, some contentious question on head on with the person that we're having it with. And in my experience, that's incredibly helpful because you will never have, we like to say in German, corpses in the cellar. You will never have sort of stuff between you and another person that poisons the relationship because it's unaddressed. But that's not a very helpful way of being when you're dealing in the political system, because so much of that is about delaying feedback, not telling people what you think because strategically it might not seem the opportune thing to do, or figuring out whom to tell what, when, and why, so that you can build alliances and so forth. And that is not a criticism of a criticism of mine of the democratic system. It's just a statement of fact that you have to be wired in a certain way to thrive in that place. And I think that's what I learned from my father. And that's also why I am not doing my political work within a political party. I am doing what I'm doing, on the sidelines by trying to create media rather than trying to rise in the hierarchy of a political party, because I'm just not wired to be that person who can do this. So maybe that's a lesson.
Beyond the intellectual or academic elements, can you talk about the emotional journey you went on from the start of thinking about making the film through making it and then to the point of, distribution? How was that experience for you?
I'm trying to think. There were different stages, of course. The first stage was one of enthusiasm and just joy. The 2 years we spent shooting the film, this was from early 2018 to early 2020, were one of my best experiences working on something ever in my life. Because for some reason, the people that we, talked to and worked with, and the ones who we needed to help us, they all seemed incredibly open and kind and happy to have us. And for some reason also, I seem to do fairly well at interviewing people. It's not something I'd been trained to do, and it's not something that I knew I would do well, but I had to jump in there and interview them. And when I sat down with Lorenzo and Catherine, they were the ones I had the most conversations with to start. It just flowed, and it was such a joyful experience. That was the first 2 years in the process, and they were, there's ups and downs, and sometimes life is complicated, and the constant traveling, it puts a drain on you and it tires you and so forth. But I think generally speaking, that was just a joyful time. And then the next 2 years, 2020 until 2022, that was in the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the film project gave me meaning and purpose. Because I sat at this very computer that we're now having this conversation on, and I edited the film myself. Usually you hire an editor, and that's a person who has a fresh look at the material, and then they help you build that vision. And we didn't, for two reasons. One is we couldn't because we didn't have funds. I had to fund myself, and I had to pay most of it out of my own pocket, so I had to be the editor myself. And the second reason is we couldn't put that burden on someone else because of the incredibly low quality of a lot of the shots we had produced. Because my friend and I, who had been shooting this with me and who'd been my partner in crime, we both were learning how to do documentary film as we were doing it. So you could say throughout the process of shooting the film, we started with very low quality, and then we ended up getting increasingly better over time, but only in the edit you see how shitty some of the material is. So basically, with my producer, we had this joke where we said, basically, we looked at all of the material we have, terabytes and terabytes, and we basically picked out every shot that is usable and used it. It's an exaggeration, but it's not far from the truth. But that experience of making the film, building it, constructing it, and I had an incredible helper, a producer by my side, Jan-Peter Heusermann, who was incredibly patient with me. And I would send him stuff. He would look at it. He would give me feedback, and then I would rework and so forth. And that process was also very joyful. That was also really, really fun. So those 4 years, I would not trade for anything. And then there were a year and a half where it was incredibly painful because the people we worked with, the production company that helped us, they did not manage to pitch the film that we'd made to outlets. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. One is, and this I learned the hard way, is that oftentimes if you've already made a film, many TV stations will no longer get interested because then they haven't co-produced it. It's not their project. It's someone else pitching something to them, and you have to really find someone who's really into this specific thing to be able to sell the film to them. And that was incredibly hard. And also, many media companies are growth oriented. And I imagine that telling a story that is a post growth story might also not necessarily fly with them in business terms. And the third reason I think that made it really hard was our film was not good enough yet. We hadn't brought it to the point where it needed to be. And so after a year and a half, in the middle of 2023, I said, look, I've had enough of this. We need to do it our own way. And so we decided to rework the film. We changed probably 20% of the film. The shots with my father at the start, they came in there. They weren't in the film before. And we sort of changed the framing and made a few changes. And then until the summer of 2024, we worked really hard to get it done. We showed a very early version, I mean, it was finished in terms of the story and everything, but the post-production wasn't quite there. But we showed an early version at the Wellbeing Economy Forum in Reykjavik in Iceland, and then had to do a lot of more work on post-production still because there were some flaws still in the film. And then in the autumn of last year, the film was done. And those 1.5 years from the summer of 23 until the end of last year, they were probably the hardest in terms of how much I worked on the film, because we started to basically create deadlines for ourselves. I made these deadlines and said, we're going to show it at the Wellbeing Economy Forum, and then we're going to have a big premiere in Berlin at the end of November. And that put so much pressure on us. But yeah, we got through it and the film's done.
I find when I'm editing content, as I have to do myself because we don't have the funds, etc., I get to the point where I get so utterly sick of what I'm looking at that I tend to despise it for a time. How did you ever get to that point when you were editing your film?
Way past that point. Like I saw that point in the rearview mirror, like miles down the road. I have to say that if anyone out there who's listening to this is contemplating making a documentary film, there's a piece of advice I can give you. No one should work on a documentary film for 7 years. That's not a good idea. 5 is probably where you should draw the line. Of course, you don't have a choice when you do it self-finance, but there's moments when you pass sort of a point of no return when the material, like if you've made stuff and you're already sick of it, but then you show it to people, you look over their shoulder as they're watching it, you still have this notion of, oh my God, I see it with fresh eyes. And you probably know what I'm talking about, right? When another person sees it.
I don't know. I'd probably say that sometimes when people respond positively to something that I've created or been involved with that's taken a lot of time and effort, I find myself sort of saying to them, really? Are you okay? Because I project my relationship with that creation onto them sometimes. I'm trying to get better at accepting that their criticism is probably better than the person who spent 40 hours looking at the screen.
Yeah, I spent thousands of hours, I think, looking at that stuff. And the problem was early in the process, I had this experience. I would be, we'd have a version of the film and I see, I've seen it all and there's going to be no surprise. And then I watch it with someone, and somehow through a weird form of osmosis, I see it through their eyes and it looks fresh and I see new flaws that I hadn't seen before. And for a while that worked. But in the last year and a half, I would watch it with other people and it would just go past me. It would not even register anymore because I'd seen it so many times that it was getting increasingly hard to even make judgment calls on things. And that's why it was great to have Jan Peter, my producer, on board, who somehow still managed to maintain a distance and still managed to see things that I couldn't see, which is another reason why more pairs of eyes than just one are incredibly necessary for making a film like that.
I think everyone will have tried to firstly write and then memorize a speech or practice a very important speech, whether it's a speech at a wedding or even at a funeral or a speech at school or for an award or a TED talk. They've practiced it so much that they get to the point where they stop focusing on the right parts and then hang on, I'm just reading this. No, I need to stop. I need to step away. So did you step away at multiple times to come back to it with fresh eyes?
I mean, in a way, that period when we hoped for the film to be picked up by stations or streamers and so forth, that was a kind of stepping away of about, it was 18 months, which is a long time. And when we came back then, in sort of in the second half of 2023, it did feel fresh again and we found new angles and that did work. But then everything after that was very tightly packed and was very much under time pressure. So there wasn't really time to step away. in that sense. I feel like what you spoke about with speeches and presentations and so forth, I think there's sort of another element to it, which is if something is so boring to you because you're so familiar with it, then you're in the right space to perform it. Because then when you go on stage and the adrenaline kicks in, that adrenaline will allow you to then shape it and form it in accordance with what the audience needs on the day. You might deliver something differently because you're so familiar with the material that you no longer need to strain your brain to remember it. But it's kind of so printed upon your brain that you can now perform it. And I think that's something that I like, when something is that boring to me that I can now perform it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. In the film, you cover quite a few setbacks with Lorenzo, setbacks with Catherine in terms of pursuing their agenda of change. You've been in this space a really long time, and I think anyone who's working at the forefront of systems change experiences a lot of setbacks. Now, you've been described as having boundless energy, as a strategic optimist. Has any part of your journey caused you to doubt at any point whether systemic economic change is possible?
Every day, I think there's two things that we need to separate in our brains. And that seems almost like a schizophrenic exercise, but I think it's important. The systems we have are incredibly powerful, and we have to acknowledge it. We can't pretend otherwise. And we're currently seeing a movement in the opposite direction. I mean, if we look at the US and at many countries around the world where billionaire fueled social media driven fascist tendencies are taking hold, we can't ignore them. So it's not looking good right now. But if we use purpose, the title of the film, as a marker maybe for what this is about, you can't find purpose if you are going knowingly walking in the wrong direction. If you know better but you behave like you don't. So I think whether or not I'm optimistic about whether it's achievable or not is one question, and we can debate this, but it's not going to take us anywhere. So what I like to prefer to talk about is what I can do today and tomorrow, and what you can do. And I'm excited about what you're doing at Maslow. I think, again, we spoke about this before the microphone was on, or before we started recording. And I think figuring out what the financial system does and how we can work within the financial system in ways that stop the destruction, to put it bluntly, both on the societal and on the environmental level, is probably one of the most commendable tasks anyone can undertake. That's my big congratulations and my thanks to the work that you do. That's what we need to focus on. And I think we can only find purpose in life if we find a goal that's worth walking towards, and if B, we take breaks from that walk. The walking can only happen so many hours in a day. And then we need to realize, yes, the climate crisis is accelerating. Yes, biodiversity is plummeting, and that's probably, that can kill humanity. Yes, our democracies are in a dire shape, but I've done my 8 hours today. I need to be able to, because still today, there's no gun violence in the streets outside here in Berlin, and there is still fresh air to breathe, and the trees are there, and there's foxes running around the city. We have foxes in Berlin. There is wildlife even encroaching on the cities and so forth. So I think you can only stay sane in this world if you find a purpose that's worth walking towards, pursuing, and that it is about making the world a better place. And if you manage to switch off from that and live in the present. And I am so grateful to have a partner who's taught me how to do that. She is an incredible master at living in the moment. And being with her allows me to do that. And I basically inherited a dog from her. Now the dog used to be her dog. He now lives with me. And there's no better animal to live in the present than a dog. He's only about the moment. So my partner and my dog, they both help me live in the present when I'm not doing this work. And those are the two things I can talk about. Whether or not it's going to work and whether or not we're going to succeed, who am I to say? Right now, it doesn't look good. But what can I do other than continue the journey,
I am trying to get much better this year at being present when I'm not working. I have a tendency to get pretty deep into my work, and ignore life, and that puts you in a place where you are ignoring the relationships that are valuable to you, and no relationship works without effort from all of the people that are in that relationship. Speaking about, you said that's all I can do. The next question is one I get asked a lot, and I was actually asked it at a party on Saturday night. Yes, I went to a party. It's pretty rare these days. How can ordinary individuals going about their lives contribute to economic systems change?
I like that you asked me this now and not 2 weeks ago, because sort of during the last 2 weeks, I had sort of an epiphany or a realization, which was handed to me thanks to a screening that we were putting on. The film Purpose finds its audiences through individuals, like you just said, who put on screenings. Somebody finds out about the film on the internet and they say to us, look, I want to show it to people, to 3 people in my living room or to 300 people in a cinema. It can be, and everything in between. And so these people put on these screenings, and I often jump on a Zoom call, or sometimes I go there and travel there if I can to see the screening in person and be part of the debate afterwards. And at this one place, they put on a screening. And at the very end of the discussion we were having, I was logging in through a video conference. One of the organizers said to the room, we want to continue this conversation. We want to keep pursuing this issue and this question of how to change our economic system. Everyone who wants to join us, please put your names on that list. We're going to have email addresses and so forth, and we're going to turn this into something that we do together. And that's when it hit me, because I've been asked this question a number of times myself. What can individual people do? And I think what they were doing right there is exactly the right thing. Turn economics into a popular sport. Make it something where you get together with people, grab your 5 best friends, invite them and say, look, you want to join me on an economic study course? And read books about post-growth, about environmental economics. Kate Raworth, Catherine Trebek, her book, Economics of Arrival. Read books by people who have thought about this for a long time and who've been able to put this into accessible writing. And then tell each other what you learned from your book and turn it into something that you do together. And from my marketing world and work, I know that people who are deeply involved with something will share it with the world around them. So we need these ripples to go out into the world where people start saying, imagine someone who's part of a study group like this, who sits and watches the news with someone else. And on the news, they go, we're happy to report that we have 2.5% GDP growth this year. And then, everyone in the room is like, oh, yeah, that's good. And then this one person goes, nah, not so sure. GDP growth, kind of a hairy issue. And they go, what? And then they can report from what they learned in their little study group to this group and infect them with curiosity about stuff that they don't know. So I think step one, and this is true for me as well. We spoke earlier about the financial system, and I had to admit that my knowledge of the financial system and how it's designed is inadequate for the kind of role I want to have in the world. So at some point or another, I will need to tackle this. And so that's the first point. And I think once you've done this for a little while, go talk to your local politician. There's a member of parliament somewhere. Get a meeting with them and say, there's an issue I need to talk to you about. And then you meet them. And if you've done a bit of studying, chances are that you'll be better placed to talk about the fallacies and the problems with GDP growth than they are. They'll just have the received wisdom of, well, of course, the economy needs to grow. Well, where would we be if it didn't? And then you come in and you have a few really well-informed questions. That's just one idea. But I think this idea that curiosity about rethinking our economy, that it can spread like ripples through a society if enough people start to take this on as their job of reading about it and talking about it and having questions about it. That's kind of my idea from the last 2 weeks. I don't know if you find it convincing, but that's the one I have right now.
No, I definitely like it. If people want to learn more about purpose, where can they find information?
So the website is purpose.film. Very easy to find. And basically, we have a little subpage. The link is called How to Watch. And there you find a small questionnaire, 5-6 questions that you can fill out in 5 minutes to tell us who you are and where you want to show the film. And then my colleague, my never tired colleague Juan Pistone, he will receive that information from you and he'll reach out to you and start an email conversation with you about what you need, how we can help you screen the film. And that's how the film gets out into the world. And we're happy for about anyone who wants to show our film because, that's the way we bring it to the people.
Now, I have one more question. A few interviews ago, I started asking the same question at the end of all of these shows. People tell me it's a horrible question, and so that's how I like to finish. I like to finish with a horrible question. If you could wave a magic wand and change just one thing in the world that you think would have the greatest positive social impact, what would it be?
I love the question, and I don't know why it's horrible. I
I
think
think because most people spend a lot of time looking at the ceiling, wondering where to start, what thread to pull.
I'll tell you how I get to my answer before I tell you the answer. My family has a little cottage, a little house in the country where we like to go, and there's forests nearby, and we take walks through that forest. And weirdly, I don't know why, my brain plays tricks on me. Often when we walk through that forest, I sometimes think, what would it be like if we put someone, and might seem completely absurd to you, but I'll say it anyway. I'll let you peek deep into my brain. I'm walking through that forest and I'm thinking, what on earth would happen if we told someone like Donald Trump to be in this forest right here, right now, and just shut the fuck up for a moment, look around for an hour, and just let it like sink in. That's where I'm coming from. And so my magic one thing probably would be, even though this sounds like it's a little far-fetched from what we spoke about, but it would be, if I could have a magic wand and make one change in the world, I would make it so that every human walking this earth would respect the living world around them, all manner of species, with the same way they respect at least their fellow human beings. I think once people thought that a tree and what it can give to the world, and my brother here and that insect, we all have a right to be here, and that only through the shared space that we occupy, life for all of us is possible in interdependencies and so forth. Once people realize that we are sharing this precious little ball in space and we are fellow travelers on this thing, the world would change and become unrecognizable from what we have right now.
Wonderful answer. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great fun.